A quiet hill in northwest Anatolia may hold the remains of the most famous war story ever told. Beneath the dust of Hisarlik lie cities built, burned, buried, and rebuilt again, a real place where myth, memory, and archaeology collide. Was Troy only a legend? Or did a forgotten Bronze Age conflict become immortal through poetry? Before we go deeper into the buried city, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if ancient mysteries like this are what you love to explore. The wind comes hard across the plain, carrying the smell of dust, dry grass, and salt from the narrow waterway beyond the hills. From a distance, the place does not look like the heart of one of the most famous stories ever told. It is not a towering ruin, not a marble city, not a field of broken columns glowing under the sun. It is a mound, broad and low, rising quietly from the northwest corner of Anatolia, near the place where Asia leans toward Europe, and the sea funnels ships through one of the most important passages in the ancient world. The hill is called Hisarlik. Beneath it lie the remains of cities built, destroyed, buried, and built again. Somewhere inside those layers is the real Troy, or at least the place that gave Troy its body before poetry gave it immortality. Stand there long enough, and the landscape begins to explain why people could not leave this place alone. To the northwest lies the Dardanelles, the ancient Hellespont, a narrow strait connecting the Aegean to the Sea of Marmara, and beyond that to the Black Sea. It is not a wide, forgiving waterway. It is a corridor of currents and winds, sometimes helpful, sometimes hostile, and in the Bronze Age, when sailors depended on season, weather, and muscle more than instruments. A ship might have to wait near this coast for days before conditions allowed it to pass. That waiting mattered. Waiting ships needed food, water, repairs, guides, trade, protection, and perhaps permission. A settlement placed near this crossing did not have to be enormous to become important. It only had to be where people had no choice but to pause. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because Troy is not just a story about a war, it is a story about how memory fastens itself to a place, how a real landscape can become larger than reality, and how a city can vanish under earth while continuing to live inside the imagination of civilizations that come centuries later. The first impression of Hisarlik can feel almost disappointing, and that disappointment is part of the mystery. For anyone raised on the image of Troy as a mighty fortress, the home of Priam, Hector, Paris, and Helen, the mound seems too quiet. The plain stretches outward in a calm that feels almost indifferent. The sea is farther away today than many visitors expect, because coastlines shift, rivers deposit silt, and landscapes change over thousands of years. In the Bronze Age, the bays and river channels around the site looked different. Marshes, inlets, and routes across the plain may have shaped the movement of people and armies in ways that are hard to reconstruct with certainty. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives in the earth suggests that ancient Troy was not isolated on an empty stage. It belonged to a changing environment of water, wind, roads, fields, and strategic pressure. That pressure is what makes the hill important. Troy sits near a threshold. To the west is the Aegean world, with islands, ships, traders, raiders, and palace centres that rise on mainland Greece. To the east is Anatolia, a land of powerful kingdoms, mountain routes, local rulers, and the shadow of the Hittite Empire. To the north, beyond the straits, are resources and routes that later ages will understand as crucial timber, grain, metals, and access to lands circling the Black Sea. No single explanation fully accounts for Troy's importance, and scholars still debate how much control the city truly had over trade through the straits. But geography gives the first clue. Places at crossings often grow rich, and places that grow rich often become targets. The hill itself is not one city but many. Archaeologists have counted a sequence of settlements stacked atop one another, each one changing the shape of the mound. Walls are raised, houses are built, streets form, fires come, earthquakes shake stone loose, people return, rubble becomes foundation. Over centuries, the dead city below becomes the ground of the living city above. This is why Troy is so difficult and so fascinating. It is not a single preserved moment, frozen like a statue. It is a palimpsest of human attempts to stay in the same place despite danger, disaster, and time. To dig there is to move downward through ambition, fear, repair, and forgetting. Long before anyone identifies the site with Homer's Troy, people know the mound is old. Local memory holds onto strange places better than official history sometimes does. Broken pottery appears in the soil. Stones sit where no ordinary stones should be. Ancient walls surface and disappear. The name Hisarlik itself suggests a place of fortification, a castle-like hill, though names are slippery and cannot prove what lies beneath. For centuries, travellers, antiquarians, and scholars search the region for the Troy of the poems, guided by classical texts, guesses, pride, and obsession. Some look elsewhere. Some doubt the poems preserve any real place at all. Troy becomes a question before it becomes an excavation. That question is powerful because the poem that makes Troy famous, the Iliad, is not really about the whole war. It does not begin with the abduction of Helen, and it does not end with the wooden horse or the burning of the city. It focuses on a short, brutal crisis near the end of a long siege, when anger inside the Greek camp becomes almost as destructive as the enemy outside the walls. Yet around that narrow slice of narrative grows an enormous world ships pulled onto a beach, warriors shining in bronze, women watching from high towers, old men speaking from walls, gods interfering in human rage, and a city whose fate seems sealed even while its people still breathe. The Troy of poetry is vivid enough to feel real, but vividness is not the same as evidence. The task of archaeology is colder, slower, and less forgiving. At Hisarlik, the earth answers, but never simply. It gives walls, pottery, bones, ash, tools, imported goods, and ruined houses. It gives signs of wealth and signs of destruction. It gives a city placed exactly where a city worth remembering might stand. But it does not give a tablet saying that Achilles was here, or that Helen looked from this tower, or that a single famous war happened exactly as later Greeks imagined it. What survives in the record suggests something more complicated and perhaps more interesting: a real city, or a sequence of cities, living at a crossroads during an age of kings, trade, diplomacy, violence, and collapse. Myth did not invent the need for walls. Poetry did not invent the fear of fire. Somewhere behind the song stands a place where people stored grain, repaired gates, buried their dead, watched ships, and listened for danger beyond the plain. The hill above the strait therefore becomes a meeting point between two kinds of truth. One is the truth of the ground, made of stone, clay, charcoal, and broken objects. The other is the truth of memory, shaped by singers, audiences, politics, grief, and pride. For a long time, these truths were treated as enemies. Either Troy was a real city just as Homer described it, or it was only a beautiful invention. But the deeper one looks, the less satisfying that choice becomes. Ancient stories often preserve fragments of older realities, altered by centuries of retelling. Archaeological sites often reveal events that resemble legend without confirming it in full. Troy belongs to that uncertain borderland, where fact and imagination do not cancel each other, but neither do they comfortably agree. At sunset, Hisarlik grows more convincing. The light lowers across the plain, and the distant water catches a dull shine. The mound no longer looks small, it looks layered, guarded, patient. The stones are damaged, the walls incomplete, and the city that once stood there has been reduced to traces. Yet the place still holds a strange authority. It is possible to imagine watchmen scanning the horizon, merchants arriving with goods from far coasts, families hearing rumours of a war, and rulers measuring their safety by the height of their walls. It is also possible to imagine later poets inheriting a memory of destruction and turning it into something vast enough to outlive every kingdom that knew the original event. Troy begins here, not with a hero, not with a horse, not with a face that launches ships, but with a hill near a dangerous passage, where history leaves just enough behind to keep the question alive. Long before Troy becomes a name carried by poets, it is first a place where geography quietly gathers power. The city does not rise in the centre of a vast empire, nor does it command a fertile river valley on the scale of Egypt or Mesopotamia. Its strength is more subtle. It stands near the edge of worlds, close enough to the sea to feel the pull of ships, close enough to Anatolia to feel the weight of inland kingdoms, and close enough to the straits to watch movement between regions that rarely remain separate for long. In ancient history, thresholds matter. A city built on a threshold can become richer than its size suggests, more nervous than its walls reveal, and more memorable than its ruins alone can explain. The people who settle at Troy are not simply guarding a dramatic view. They are living inside a working landscape. The plain below the mound is shaped by rivers, seasonal wetlands, low hills, and routes leading inland. Herds can move through it. Farmers can use parts of it. Travellers can cross it on their way between the coast and the Anatolian interior. The sea offers connection, but it also brings strangers. In such a setting, a settlement must become alert by habit. Every sail on the horizon could mean trade, news, opportunity, or danger. Every caravan from the interior could bring goods, messages, or pressure from a stronger ruler. This is one of the lesser-known realities behind famous ancient cities. They are rarely famous to themselves in the way later generations imagine. To their inhabitants, they are places of work, negotiation, storage, repair, fear, and daily calculation. Troy's location near the Dardanelles gives it a special kind of importance, though scholars still debate exactly how much control it could exercise over passage through the strait. It is tempting to imagine Troy as a toll gate, forcing every ship to pay before moving toward the Black Sea, but the evidence does not allow so simple a picture. Bronze Age maritime movement is difficult to reconstruct. Ships may have hugged coastlines, waited for favourable winds, and used multiple anchorages. Authority over such movement may have been irregular, negotiated, or seasonal rather than absolute. Still, even without total control, proximity matters. A city near a difficult sea passage can profit from waiting ships, local exchange, pilots, supplies, and information. Information itself is a form of wealth. Whoever hears first about foreign ships, distant conflicts, or shifting alliances has an advantage. The Bronze Age world is not a world of isolated villages staring blankly into the unknown. It is a connected, restless system. Tin travels across long distances to make bronze. Copper moves from mining regions to workshops and palaces, textiles, oils, wine, ivory, amber, horses, weapons, and luxury objects pass through networks of exchange that reach farther than any single ruler can easily command. Troy sits near one edge of this web, but edges are not empty. They are often where worlds meet with the greatest intensity. A merchant or envoy coming from the Aegean might find Troy familiar enough to negotiate with, yet foreign enough to treat carefully. A ruler from inland Anatolia might see Troy as a useful ally, a troublesome frontier city, or a prize worth influencing. What survives in the record suggests a place drawn into larger currents, not a lonely fortress waiting for legend to find it. The city's wealth, such as it is, likely comes from several modest streams rather than one magical source. Agriculture in the surrounding region helps sustain the population. Herding and local craft production add to its base. Maritime contact brings imported goods and outside styles. Strategic position brings visitors who need services and protection. Over time, these streams can create a community with enough resources to build walls, maintain elites, and attract envy. The walls are important not only as military structures but as public statements. In a world where stone and mud brick require labour, organisation, and authority, a wall tells approaching strangers that people here can command work, defend property, and imagine danger before it arrives. Yet Troy is never merely a Greek city waiting to be claimed by Greek memory. This point matters, because later literature can make the Trojan world feel like a mirror of the Aegean heroic past. Archaeology and geography point to something more Anatolian, more mixed, and more complex. The people of Troy live on the western edge of Anatolia, in a zone where influences overlap. Their pottery, architecture, burial customs, and material culture do not fit neatly into a single simple identity. They are connected to the Aegean, but they are not simply Mycenaean. They are connected to Anatolia, but they are not just a provincial copy of inland powers. Borderland societies often develop this layered character. They borrow, adapt, resist, and translate. They know how to deal with outsiders because outsiders are part of normal life. This mixed identity may be one reason Troy becomes so suitable for myth. It can be imagined as near and far at the same time. To later Greek audiences, Troy lies across the sea, foreign enough to be an enemy city, but close enough to be understood. Its princes can speak in familiar heroic patterns. Its warriors can show courage equal to their attackers. Its women can suffer in ways that feel intimate rather than abstract. The real city's position between worlds becomes, in memory, a moral and emotional position as well. Troy is not a faceless barbarian stronghold. It is the enemy that resembles the self, which makes its destruction more haunting. The land around Troy also teaches a lesson about how places change after stories attach to them. The plain of the Iliad, with its battlefield between ships and walls, does not map perfectly onto the modern terrain. Rivers have shifted, Sediment has pushed coastlines outward. Ancient bays have silted up. The evidence remains incomplete, and specialists still reconstruct the Bronze Age environment with caution. But the changing landscape does not weaken the story. It deepens it. It reminds us that ancient places are not stage sets preserved for our convenience. They move slowly under the pressure of water, wind, farming, erosion, and human use. A battlefield can become farmland. A harbour can become dry ground. A city once close to water can seem strangely inland to later eyes. In that shifting landscape, Troy's people live with both opportunity and vulnerability. A settlement that benefits from movement can also be threatened by movement. The same routes that carry trade can carry raiders. The same strait that brings wealth can bring fleets. The same political importance that wins allies can attract enemies. No single explanation fully accounts for the conflicts that may have touched Troy, but its location makes conflict unsurprising. At a crossroads, peace is rarely just the absence of war. It is an achievement maintained through gifts, marriages, promises, intimidation, and watchfulness. Before legend hardens around the name, then, Troy is already a city of tension. It is built from practical advantages rather than destiny, from soil, water, trade, labour, and fear. Its people may never imagine that singers centuries later will turn their home into the symbol of a vanished heroic age. They may be more concerned with harvests, repairs, storms, debts, alliances, and the next ship waiting on the wind. Yet those ordinary pressures are exactly what make the place historically alive. Troy becomes legendary not because it floats outside reality, but because reality at this narrow crossing is already dramatic enough. A city between seas and kingdoms does not need gods to be dangerous. It only needs wealth, walls, memory, and neighbours with reasons to come. To understand Troy, the eye has to learn to look downward rather than outward. Most famous cities invite the imagination to rebuild towers, temples, gates, and streets rising into the air. Troy asks for the opposite movement. Its story is compressed underfoot. One city sinks beneath another, and another above that, until the hill becomes less like a ruin than a buried archive made of walls, ash, clay, and human insistence. The people who lived there did not think of themselves as occupying a future archaeological puzzle. They built houses where earlier houses had collapsed. They levelled rubble, reused stones, filled hollows, repaired terraces, and trusted the old ground because it had already held life before. Over centuries, this simple habit of return created one of the most complicated sites in ancient history. The mound at Hisarlik contains many major settlement phases, often labelled by archaeologists as Troy I, Troy II, Troy III, and onward through later periods. These labels make the sequence sound neat, almost as if each city politely ended before the next began. The reality is messier. Settlements change gradually, burn unevenly, expand, shrink, recover, and leave behind evidence that can be difficult to separate. A wall may belong to one phase, a floor to another. A pit may cut down through layers older than the people who dug it, and later builders may disturb earlier remains without knowing what they are destroying. Archaeology here is not simply discovery. It is interpretation under pressure, because every trench enters a place where time is stacked rather than spread. The earliest communities at the mound are already significant because they show that this location mattered long before the age associated with the Trojan War. In the 3rd millennium, BCE, Troy is a fortified settlement with stone foundations, mud brick structures, and evidence of craft, storage, and exchange. It is not the vast city of later imagination, but it is not nothing. It has organization, it has defenses, it has people capable of shaping the hill into a place of permanence. The presence of fortification this early suggests that the inhabitants understood both the value and the danger of their position. Walls do not appear in a landscape because life is simple. They appear when something must be protected, or when rulers want others to believe it is protected. One of the most dramatic early phases is often linked with what archaeologists call Troy II, a settlement destroyed by fire. It was once mistaken for Homer's Troy, partly because early excavators were eager to find the city of Priam, and partly because the destruction seemed grand enough to fit the legend. In this level, rich finds emerged, including metal vessels, jewellery, weapons, and ornaments that became famous under the misleading name of Priam's treasure. The name was powerful, but it was wrong. The treasure belonged to a period far earlier than the likely setting of any historical conflict behind the Iliad. This is one of the surprising lessons of Troy. Sometimes the evidence most suited to romance is the evidence that leads furthest from the truth. A burned city with gold is not automatically the burned city of song. The mistake matters because it reveals how easily desire can shape interpretation. When people search for Troy, they often search not only with tools but with expectations. They want a single city, a single fire, a single war, a single moment when myth turns into fact. Hisarlik refuses to be that simple. Several Troys suffer destruction. Several are rebuilt. Some phases look modest, others more impressive. Some layers show local continuity, others show outside influence. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how best to connect particular destruction levels with events remembered in later Greek tradition. But the mound makes one thing unmistakable: Troy is not a legend attached to an empty hill. It is a real place of repeated occupation, and repeated occupation means repeated reasons to return. As the settlement grows and changes, its builders reshape the hill itself. Defensive walls rise in circuits, sometimes with sloping stone faces that give the mound a strong, engineered appearance. Houses cluster inside the fortifications. Gateways control movement. Storage spaces hint at planning and surplus. Pottery styles shift, reflecting local habits and broader connections. Imported objects suggest contact beyond the immediate region. Even when the city is not enormous by the standards of Egypt or Mesopotamia, it has a density of meaning. A small fortified centre near a strategic passage can matter more than its area on a map. Power in the Bronze Age is not always measured by size alone. It is measured by access, alliances, goods, and the ability to survive in a dangerous location. Later levels, especially those dated to the Late Bronze Age, draw the closest attention because they stand nearer the world that may lie behind the Trojan War tradition. Here the city appears more complex than early skeptics once believed. The citadel is strongly fortified, and evidence suggests a lower town beyond the main walls, though its full extent and population remain debated. This is important because a fortress alone might seem too small for the grandeur of epic. But a citadel with a surrounding settlement begins to look more like a regional centre. It may have housed elites, craftspeople, labourers, families, animals, stores, and visitors moving through the area. What survives in the record suggests a living community rather than a stage built for heroes. Yet even at its height, Troy remains difficult to see whole. Much of what was once mud brick has vanished or survived only as traces. Later construction damaged earlier remains. Early excavation methods removed material that modern archaeologists would have studied carefully. Erosion, an ancient rebuilding, altered the evidence before anyone in modern times arrived. The city is therefore both revealed and wounded. Every confident reconstruction has to carry a quiet warning. Part of the picture is missing. This does not make Troy less real. It makes it more human. Real cities are not preserved for later certainty. They decay, are reused, are misunderstood, and are sometimes damaged by the very people trying to uncover them. A city built in layers also changes the meaning of destruction. In a single-story ruin, fire can look final. At Troy, fire is often only punctuation. A blaze may end one phase, but not the life of the hill. An earthquake may crack walls, but people return with new plans. A political crisis may weaken the settlement, but someone still finds value in rebuilding. This persistence is one of the deepest facts about Troy. The place survives not because it is untouched, but because it is repeatedly touched by catastrophe and still reoccupied. Its identity is not purity. Its identity is endurance. That endurance may be part of why later memory could cling to the site. Stories favour places that seem to have absorbed more than one lifetime can hold. By the time Greek singers shape tales of a great war, the mound may already have been old beyond easy comprehension. Ruined walls, visible stones, and local traditions could have encouraged the belief that something mighty had happened there. The singers did not need to understand every layer. They needed only a place where the past felt heavy. Hisarlik offered that weight. Beneath the quiet hill were centuries of building, burning, repairing, and beginning again. And somewhere inside that accumulation lay the kind of truth that myth knows how to use, not a perfect record, but a memory of human ambition pressed into the ground. Around Troy, the world is growing larger than any one hill can contain. By the late Bronze Age, the Eastern Mediterranean is no longer a scattered patchwork of isolated communities living by local custom alone. It is a restless arena of palace kingdoms, coastal routes, diplomatic marriages, tribute, gifts, threats, and carefully measured violence. Ships move across the Aegean carrying pottery, oil, wine, textiles, weapons, and rumours. Caravans cross Anatolia with metals, horses, wool, and messages sealed by rulers who may never meet face to face. In palaces from mainland Greece to central Anatolia, from Syria to Egypt, elites live inside a system that feels powerful because it is so connected, and fragile for exactly the same reason. Troy stands near the edge of this world, but an edge can be a dangerous place to live, because it receives the pressure of every direction at once. The great powers of the age do not all look the same. Egypt has its ancient bureaucracy, temples, royal monuments, and scribes recording victories in language polished for eternity. The Hittite Empire, ruling from the Anatolian interior, commands vassals, treaties, armies, and a network of dependent lands that must be watched constantly. The Mycenaean palace centres of mainland Greece, including places such as Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, and Thebes, are smaller than Egypt or Hatti, yet intensely organised, with fortified citadels, storerooms, workshops, and rulers who gather wealth through land, labour, trade, and war. Between these powers lie smaller kingdoms and cities, some loyal, some wavering, some simply trying to survive. What survives in the record suggests a world where status depends not only on strength, but on the ability to manage relationships. Those relationships are often expressed through gifts. To modern eyes, gifts can seem decorative, almost ceremonial, but in the Bronze Age they are political instruments. A ruler sends gold, horses, fine cloth, weapons, carved ivory, lapis, or skilled workers, and the exchange says something precise without needing a battlefield. It may say friendship, it may say equality, it may say dependence disguised as courtesy, it may say that one king expects another to remember a favour. In letters from the wider Near Eastern world, rulers call one another brothers when they want to appear equal, and they complain bitterly when the gifts they receive seem too small. There is a dry human familiarity in this. Even kings who claim divine favour can sound offended when the shipment of gold is disappointing. Troy's own archives, if they existed, have not survived in a way that gives us the city's voice. That silence is one of the great frustrations. We see Troy mostly through archaeology and through the writings of others, especially later Greek poetry and possibly Hittite references from Anatolia. No single explanation fully accounts for Troy's political position. Was it a small kingdom, a fortified town under a regional ruler, a vassal, a semi-independent border city? Or something that changed from generation to generation? Scholars still debate the details. But the wider Late Bronze Age world helps frame the possibilities. A settlement near the Dardanelles could hardly remain untouched by powers that cared about movement, access, and influence. It may not have commanded empires, but it existed in a world where even modest cities could become valuable pieces in larger games. Warrior elites dominate much of this world, though not in the simple heroic way later poetry imagines. Bronze Age warfare is practical, organised, and expensive. Chariots require horses, training, maintenance, and skilled crews. Metal weapons require access to copper and tin is not locally available everywhere. Fortifications require coordinated labour. Armies require food. A warrior's glory depends on farmers, herders, smiths, carpenters, scribes, servants, and storehouse managers whose names almost never survive. The shining bronze spear is only the visible tip of a much larger system. This is a lesser-known truth behind the age of heroes' heroism. Where it exists is supported by administration. The palaces of the Mycenaean world show this clearly. Their linear B tablets, preserved accidentally when fires baked them hard, record livestock, land, rations, textiles, armour, chariot parts, offerings, and personnel. They are not epic poems. They are accounting documents, and that is what makes them so revealing. The world that later Greek memory turns into a landscape of individual champions is, in its own surviving paperwork, a world of inventories. Bronze Age power counts things. It counts wheels, hides, oil, women workers, bronze grain, and vessels. The evidence remains incomplete, but it shows that elite violence does not float above daily labour. It rests heavily upon it. Troy, too, must be imagined with this balance in mind. Behind any prints on a wall stand people grinding grain, mending cloth, tending animals, carrying water, shaping clay, and repairing damage after storms or conflict. A city near a strategic route needs watchmen, messengers, interpreters, and negotiators as much as fighters. It needs people who understand the moods of ships and seasons. It needs storage against uncertainty. It needs leaders who can decide when to welcome strangers and when to bar the gate. The walls may draw the eye, but the life inside them is made of routines repeated until danger interrupts them. Diplomacy and violence are not opposites in this world, they are partners. A treaty might follow a campaign, a marriage might prevent one, a gift might conceal a threat, a raid might test the weakness of a neighbour without becoming a full war. Small conflicts could flare along frontier zones where authority was disputed or unclear. Western Anatolia, where Troy belongs, appears in Hittite records as a region of shifting loyalties and occasional unrest. The exact connection between these records and Homeric Troy remains uncertain, but the atmosphere they reveal is useful. This is not a peaceful borderland waiting for one mythical quarrel to disturb it. It is a politically sensitive region where local rulers, outside powers, and seaborne groups may all have had reasons to interfere. Trade adds another layer of risk. The late Bronze Age economy depends on long-distance connections, and those connections can enrich cities while making them vulnerable to disruption. If copper fails to arrive, bronze production suffers. If tin routes are interrupted, weapons and tools become harder to supply. If ships are lost, alliances weaken and stores diminish. If a powerful patron collapses, dependent communities are exposed. The system is impressive, but it is not invincible. Its strength lies in connection, yet connection can carry crisis as easily as wealth. Seen from this angle, Troy is not merely the backdrop for a legendary siege. It is part of a wider age in which kings build walls because they understand insecurity, exchange gifts because they fear isolation, and send warriors because negotiation has limits. The city's later fame can make it seem exceptional, but its world is filled with other places balancing ambition and danger. Troy becomes unforgettable not because it stands outside the Bronze Age, but because it captures the age's deepest tensions in one landscape: wealth beside vulnerability, contact beside suspicion, memory beside silence, and a fortified hill watching the routes where kingdoms meet. Across the Aegean, on the rocky mainland of Greece, another world is rising behind massive walls. The Mycenaean kingdoms do not look like the later Greece of open-air philosophy, marble temples, and city-states arguing in public assemblies. They are older, harder, more enclosed. Their centres sit on fortified heights, with thick stone walls, narrow gates, storerooms, workshops, courts, and halls where rulers display power through feasting, weapons, seals, textiles, and bronze. From places such as Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, and other palace centres, these rulers look outward across a sea broken by islands and routes. The Aegean is not a barrier to them. It is a road, dangerous but familiar. And on the far side of that road lies Anatolia, with Troy near one of its most tempting thresholds. The Mycenaeans inherit and transform a maritime world that has already been shaped by Minoan Crete and older networks of exchange. They do not invent seafaring in the Aegean, but they become formidable participants in it. Their pottery travels widely. Their goods appear in foreign contexts. Their elites adopt, adapt, and compete for symbols of prestige that move across the Eastern Mediterranean. They are not a single unified Greek empire in the later sense, and scholars still debate how coordinated their political actions could be beyond individual palace territories. But they share language, material culture, elite customs, and a taste for expansion that leaves traces across islands, coasts, and trading stations. Their world is divided, yet connected enough to act with recognizable force. It is easy to imagine these kingdoms only through the later heroic lens, kings gathering under a single commander. fleets assembled for honour, warriors crossing the sea because one woman has been taken. The archaeological reality is less romantic and more interesting. Mycenaean rulers have practical reasons to look east. They need metals, especially the materials that make bronze possible. They desire luxury goods that confirm status at home. They seek allies, trading privileges, and perhaps opportunities for raiding. A ship can carry gifts one season and armed men another. The same coastline that welcomes merchants can attract violence if political conditions change. No single explanation fully accounts for Mycenaean movement into Anatolian waters, but the evidence suggests sustained contact rather than one isolated adventure. Their ships are not the floating castles of later imagination. They are wooden vessels dependent on skilled crews, coastal knowledge, and weather. Bronze Age sailors often move by sighting land, using islands and headlands as stepping stones through this sea. The Aegean, with its chains of islands, encourages this style of travel. A route from mainland Greece toward northwest Anatolia does not require a leap into emptiness. It requires patience, timing, and experience. Men who make such voyages know harbours, currents, freshwater points, and local dangers. They also know that every landing is a negotiation. A beach is never just a beach if someone nearby claims it. For Troy, this matters deeply. Aegean sailors approaching the Dardanelles would not see the city as myth. They would see a fortified settlement near a difficult passage, a place that might offer supplies, trade, and information, but also demand caution. The city's position gives it value to those who move by sea. It may serve as a contact point between Mycenaean traders and Anatolian networks. It may also become an obstacle if relations sour. What survives in their record suggests contact between Troy and the Aegean, though the meaning of that contact remains debated. Imported pottery and stylistic influences can prove exchange, but exchange alone does not prove conquest, alliance, or war. A pot can travel farther than an army. Still, the Mycenaean presence in western Anatolia cannot be dismissed. Hittite texts seem to refer to Ahiawa, a powerful Western entity that many scholars connect with the Achaean or Mycenaean world, though the exact political structure behind the name remains uncertain. These texts suggest that Western Anatolia is not beyond Mycenaean interest. It is a contested zone where local rulers, Hittite power, and Aegean influence overlap. This does not give us the Trojan War, not directly. It gives us something more cautious but more solid, a geopolitical environment in which conflicts involving Aegean powers and Anatolian cities are entirely plausible. The Mycenaean warrior elite is built for such a world. Their graves contain weapons, gold, carved stones, and objects that speak of both violence and display. Their palaces maintain equipment for chariots and armour. Their art shows hunting, combat, processions, and symbols of dominance. Yet beneath the glitter is a society constantly organising resources. The Linear B tablets show palace administrators tracking materials with intense attention. Warriors need bronze. Chariots need wheels. Horses need fodder. Ships need timber and crews. A campaign across the sea is not merely an eruption of anger. It is logistics, and logistics leave fewer glorious stories than spears do. This makes the later image of a vast Greek expedition both believable in spirit and uncertain in detail. Mycenaean rulers had ships, they had military elites, they had reasons to interfere overseas. They lived in a competitive world where prestige, trade, and power were intertwined. But whether they ever formed a grand coalition exactly like the one remembered in epic is another matter. the evidence remains incomplete. Later poetry may preserve the memory of many smaller conflicts compressed into one monumental war. It may magnify a real campaign. It may combine old tales of raiding, alliance, siege, and destruction into a single story strong enough to survive oral tradition. What cannot be responsibly claimed is that the Iliad is a direct historical report. What cannot be easily denied is that its world contains echoes of a real Bronze Age horizon. The Mycenaeans themselves disappear as palace powers not long after the period in which a historical Trojan conflict might have occurred. Their citadels suffer destruction, their administrative systems collapse, their writing falls out of use. Later Greeks remember them not through bureaucratic tablets, which are forgotten, but through song. This creates a strange distortion. The actual Mycenaean world is both preserved and transformed by people who no longer fully understand it. Bronze weapons become symbols of a heroic past. Palace rulers become epic kings. Old conflicts become moral dramas. Across the sea, Troy becomes the enemy city that gives that heroic world its greatest test. For the people of Troy, Mycenaean ships on the horizon may have meant many things over time. Some bring trade, some bring envoys, some bring raiders, some may bring men who know the coast well enough to become dangerous. The relationship does not have to begin in hatred to end in violence. Borderlands often live through long periods of contact before a crisis turns familiar strangers into enemies. That possibility gives the Trojan story its historical weight. The war behind the poem, if there was one, may not begin with a single insult or a stolen queen. It may grow from years of competition across the sea, from trade routes, alliances, local disputes, and the ambitions of palace kings who understand that a city near the straits is too useful to ignore. Somewhere between the ships of the Mycenaeans and the walls of Troy, the question becomes unavoidable: what kind of war could stand behind the poem? Not the war exactly as later audiences inherit it, with gods stepping into combat, heroes glowing larger than life, and a wooden horse waiting at the edge of memory, but a human conflict made of ambition, fear, miscalculation, and material need. The Iliad is not a chronicle, and it never pretends to be the careful report of a palace scribe. It is a poem shaped by generations of singers, polished by memory, enlarged by performance, and filled with meanings that belong as much to later Greek culture as to the Bronze Age. Yet poems do not have to be factual in every detail to preserve the outline of a real wound. The harder task is to look for the wound without mistaking the song for the scar. A real conflict over Troy would not need to begin with Helen. That does not make Helen meaningless. In myth, she becomes the human face of an international crisis, the beautiful centre around which honour, desire, oath, and revenge gather until armies move. But in the Bronze Age world, wars rarely require a single romantic cause. They come from pressure building over time. A city near a strategic sea route may anger a trading partner, shift allegiance, shelter enemies, disrupt access, or become too valuable to leave alone. A local dispute may draw in larger powers. A raid may lead to retaliation. A diplomatic insult may expose a deeper economic rivalry. No single explanation fully accounts for the Trojan War tradition, but the setting itself offers many possible sparks. The idea of a 10-year siege is one of the most famous features of the myth, and also one of the most difficult to treat historically. Long sieges are not impossible in the ancient world, but they are costly, exhausting, and logistically demanding. An army camped far from home needs food, water, shelter, discipline, replacement equipment, and secure lines of support. Ships must be maintained, alliances must hold, leaders must keep warriors from drifting away, fighting among themselves, or seeking easier prizes. A literal 10-year continuous siege by a huge united Greek army may be poetic magnification. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate whether the tradition compresses a series of campaigns, seasonal raids, and intermittent conflicts into the image of one long encampment before the walls. Such compression is common in memory. A generation may remember years of instability as one war. Several attacks on the same region may become a single expedition. Local struggles may be gathered under the names of famous leaders. A city destroyed during a period of wider conflict may later become the focus of all the anxieties and losses of that age. Troy is perfectly suited for this kind of memory making. It stands at a place where Aegean and Anatolian interests meet. It has strong walls. It suffers destruction at points in its long history. It exists in the right broad era for a late Bronze Age conflict to become attached to later heroic tradition. None of this proves the Iliad as history, but it makes the complete dismissal of a historical core feel too simple. The war behind the poem, if there was one, may have been smaller than legend and still devastating to those who lived through it. A force arriving by sea does not need to be the full might of every Mycenaean palace to terrify a city. A coalition of regional rulers, a raiding fleet, or an alliance of ambitious elites could place enormous pressure on a fortified settlement. The attackers might not aim at noble revenge. They might want plunder, control of movement, punishment of a hostile ruler, or influence over a coastline. In such a world, war is not always a clean conquest. It can be a prolonged contest of raids, blockades, burned fields, broken alliances, and attempts to starve or frighten a city into submission. For the Trojans, the experience would be measured not in epic speeches but in shrinking choices. Farmers outside the walls become vulnerable first. Fields near the city cannot be worked safely. Herds may be driven away or stolen. Wells and paths become dangerous. Families retreat behind defences, bringing animals, tools, stored grain, and fear into crowded spaces. The powerful may debate strategy, but ordinary people feel war as hunger, noise, smoke, and uncertainty. A fortified citadel protects, but it also confines. Each day of waiting becomes a calculation how much food remains, whether allies are coming, whether the attackers will leave with the season, whether the walls can hold if the gates are forced. The poem remembers war through heroes, and that is one of its beauties, but also one of its distortions. In the Iliad, the battlefield is filled with named men whose deaths matter because their fathers, homelands, armour, and courage are briefly brought into the light. This may preserve something genuine about elite warfare, where reputation and lineage carried enormous weight. But real Bronze Age violence also involved people who would never be named in song servants carrying water, craftsmen repairing shields, rowers pulling ships ashore, women managing households under siege, children learning fear before they understand politics, and captives whose lives become bargaining pieces. What survives in the record rarely gives these people voices. Yet any historical war at Troy would have been built upon their suffering as much as upon the pride of kings. The gods of the poem must also be handled carefully. They do not prove that the story is pure fantasy, any more than divine language in Egyptian or Hittite royal inscriptions proves that those battles never happened. Ancient people often explained political and military events through divine favour, anger, or interference. Later singers shaped that worldview into scenes of gods taking sides, deceiving warriors, saving favourites, and magnifying human rage. Beneath that divine machinery may lie a very human memory of unpredictability. War often feels irrational to those trapped inside it. An arrow flies from nowhere, a storm wrecks ships, a leader's anger destroys strategy, a plague spreads through a camp. To ancient imagination, such events easily become the work of gods. The strongest historical approach is therefore neither blind belief nor easy skepticism. It accepts that the Iliad is a poetic masterpiece, not a battlefield report, while also recognizing that its world contains Bronze Age echoes too persistent to ignore. The weapons, values, funeral practices, political tensions, and geography are not always accurate in a strict archaeological sense, but they are not detached from deep memory either. The poem carries layers, just as the mound does. Some details may come from the late Bronze Age, others belong to later centuries, still others are timeless features of human conflict, pride, grief, loyalty, fear, exhaustion, and the terrible need to give meaning to destruction. The war behind the poem may never come fully into view. It may remain a shape seen through dust, half history and half inheritance. But that uncertainty is not a failure of the story. It is the reason Troy endures. A perfectly documented war would belong more comfortably to the archive. Troy belongs to the border between archive and dream, where the known and the imagined press against each other like layers in the hill. Something happened there, or near there, or to a city remembered as there, with enough force to leave behind not only ruins but a tradition of ruin. The poem turns that force into song. History tries to find the human event beneath it. Between them stands Troy, still guarded by its walls, still waiting for the truth to be approached with caution. The ground at Troy does not speak in complete sentences. It speaks in fragments, a scorched patch of floor, a fallen stone, a wall thickened in one rebuilding and repaired in another, a storage jar left where panic or destruction interrupted normal life. These are not the clean clues of a solved crime. They are damaged remains from a city that lived too long, suffered too often, and was dug too roughly in its early modern history for every layer to remain intact. Yet among these fragments, one fact keeps returning with stubborn force. Troy was a place that expected danger. Its walls were not decorative. Its gates were not casual openings in a town boundary. Its builders invested labour in defence, and defence is always a confession that fear has become part of urban planning. The walls of late Bronze Age Troy are among the most important pieces of evidence in the long debate over the city's historical reality. They do not prove the Trojan War, but ye prove that the settlement was fortified in a serious way. Massive stone foundations, sloping lower courses, towers, and controlled entrances suggest a community that understood both strength and display. A wall can stop attackers, but it can also speak before an attack begins. It tells approaching strangers that the people inside possess resources, leadership, and the ability to command labour. It also tells them that whatever lies inside is worth protecting. In the ancient world, where power often has to be seen to be believed, masonry becomes a political language. The famous image of Troy's walls in later poetry is grander than anything archaeology can responsibly reconstruct in full. But the archaeological walls are impressive enough to matter. They enclose a citadel, and beyond that citadel there appears to have been a lower settlement, partly indicated by traces such as a defensive ditch and patterns of occupation outside the main fortress. Scholars still debate the size, density, and exact character of this lower town, but its possibility changes the scale of the site. Troy was not necessarily just a small stronghold perched on a hill. It may have been a fortified centre with a broader community around it, a place where elites lived above while craftspeople, labourers, traders, and families occupied the surrounding area. The evidence remains incomplete, yet it points toward a more substantial settlement than early critics once allowed. Then there is the destruction. Troy has several destructions, and that is where the story becomes complicated. For anyone hoping to find one perfect layer of ash matching one perfect war, Hisarlik is frustrating. Fire appears in more than one period. Damage may come from different causes. Some destructions look violent, others may be accidental, seismic, or connected to abandonment and rebuilding. The city's long life means that catastrophe is not a single event but a repeated visitor. Archaeologists have focused especially on late Bronze Age levels often known as Troy 6 and Troy 7a, because they fall closer to the period in which a historical conflict behind the Trojan tradition might plausibly belong. But even here, certainty slips away as soon as it seems close. Troy 6 is a powerful and wealthy-looking settlement, with impressive fortifications and signs of broad contacts. Its end appears to involve significant destruction, and many scholars have argued that earthquake damage may explain much of it. Walls are displaced in ways that can suggest seismic force. The region is earthquake-prone, and ancient cities in such landscapes often lived with the threat of sudden ruin from below rather than from beyond the walls. An earthquake can destroy gates, crack towers, kill inhabitants, and leave a city vulnerable to later attack. It is less poetic than a siege, but no less terrifying. One of the lesser-known possibilities is that natural disaster and human violence need not be rivals in the explanation. An earthquake-damaged city can become an easier target. A weakened wall can invite enemies who might not have dared approach before. Troy 7, or A, following after Troy 6, is often brought even more directly into discussions of a possible Trojan War. This level appears more cramped, with houses subdivided and large storage jars sunk into floors, perhaps suggesting stress, crowding, or preparation for a shortage. Some have seen in this the signature of siege conditions, people storing food within the city, living under pressure, and making space where they can. There are also indications of destruction by fire. A few weapons or weapon-like finds have been discussed, though the amount of clear battle evidence is limited. No single explanation fully accounts for all the signs. The picture is suggestive, but not decisive. Archaeology gives tension, damage, and fear. It does not give a battle narrative. That absence matters. A city can burn without being conquered by a legendary army. A fire might follow attack, accident, earthquake, internal conflict, or some combination of events. Weapons may be removed, reused, looted, or never deposited in large numbers. Human remains may not survive where one expects them, or may not have been excavated under conditions that allow firm conclusions. Ancient destruction is not always generous with evidence. The desire to match every broken stone to a line of epic poetry can lead the mind too quickly from clue to conclusion. Responsible history must pause at the gap. What survives in the record suggests that Troy experienced serious disruption in the late Bronze Age, possibly violent and possibly connected to wider instability. It does not allow the whole poem to step fully into fact. Still, the physical details are powerful because they return the story to human scale. Imagine a gate damaged, whether by earthquake, fire, or assault. For the people inside, the cause matters less in the first moments than the soundstone grinding, timber cracking, animals panicking, dust filling the air. A wall that has stood for generations suddenly becomes uncertain. A tower leans. A passage is blocked. Someone runs for water. Someone searches for a child. Someone looks outward and realizes that if enemies are near, the city's strength has just changed. The archaeological record preserves none of those faces, but it preserves the conditions in which such moments could happen. The storage jars of Troy 7a are especially haunting because they hint at anticipation. Grain, oil, pulses, water, and other necessities are not glorious, but they decide whether a city can endure. Epic remembers spears and shields. Archaeology often remembers containers. A jar set into a floor may be a practical household feature, but in a pressured settlement, storage becomes strategy. Food inside walls means time. Time means survival, negotiation, or waiting for allies. If the jars do reflect a community under threat, they bring us closer to the lived experience of siege than any shining weapon does. Hunger is quieter than battle, but it is often more decisive. The broken gates and burn layers of Troy therefore do not solve the mystery. They deepen it. They show that the city was defensible, desirable, vulnerable, and repeatedly damaged. They show a place where the kinds of events later transformed into epic could have happened. Even if the epic itself cannot be excavated, the walls stand as evidence of fear before violence. The fires stand as evidence of catastrophe after fear. Between them lies the space where history and memory begin to overlap. Not perfectly, but closely enough to keep the old question alive. Long after the walls of late Bronze Age Troy crack, burn, or fall silent, the story continues to travel without stone. It moves in voices. It passes from singer to singer, from hall to hall, from one generation to another that no longer sees the world exactly as the old warriors saw it. This is the strange survival at the heart of Troy. The city may be damaged, abandoned, rebuilt, transformed, and misunderstood. But the memory of a war across the sea keeps breathing in oral tradition. By the time the Iliad takes the form known to later Greece, the Bronze Age palace world that may have produced its oldest memories is already gone. Its scribes are gone, its administrative tablets are buried, its political map has changed beyond recognition, yet something of that vanished age remains, not as a document but as song. Oral tradition is not a weak form of memory simply because it changes. In societies where poetry is performed aloud, trained singers can preserve names, formulas, scenes, and story patterns with remarkable discipline. Repeated phrases help the rhythm. Familiar episodes give audiences a structure they recognize. Names of heroes, places, weapons, and lineages can survive because they are woven into the music of the verse. But oral tradition is also alive. It adapts to new audiences. It absorbs later customs. It forgets what no longer makes sense and preserves what still has emotional force. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives in epic suggests a long process in which memories of Bronze Age conflict are reshaped through centuries of performance. This explains why the Iliad feels both ancient and layered. Some details seem to echo a world older than the poet's own age. The prominence of bronze weapons, the importance of chariots, the grandeur of fortified palaces, and the memory of powerful kings ruling from citadels all point backward toward the Late Bronze Age. Yet other details belong more naturally to later periods. When iron is known, cremation practices differ, and social arrangements have shifted. The poem is not a sealed capsule from one century. It is more like Troy's mound itself, layer upon layer, with older material reused inside newer forms. Scholars still debate how much of the poem reflects genuine Bronze Age memory, and how much comes from later poetic invention, but the mixture is precisely what makes it valuable. It shows memory at work. The chariot is one of the clearest examples of this layered remembering. In the Late Bronze Age, chariots can be elite military equipment, expensive to maintain and symbolically powerful. In the Iliad, warriors often ride chariots to the battlefield, dismount, fight on foot, and then use the chariot again for movement or escape. This does not always match what scholars reconstruct as chariot warfare in other Bronze Age contexts, where chariots may serve as mobile platforms or elite battlefield vehicles. The poem seems to remember the prestige of chariots, but not necessarily every practical detail of how they were used. A real object survives in memory, but its function has become blurred. That blur is not a failure. It is a trace of time passing between event and song. Weapons carry the same tension. The poem loves bronze. Spears, helmets, breastplates, shields, and shining armour fill its world with a metallic brightness. Bronze is historically fitting for a late Bronze Age setting, yet the poem also belongs to audiences who know iron. Sometimes the old and new materials coexist in ways that reveal the long life of the tradition. A singer does not need to be an archaeologist. He needs to make the past feel old, noble, and convincing to listeners. Bronze becomes not just a material but an atmosphere, a way of placing the story in a heroic distance before the ordinary present. Names may preserve even deeper echoes. The catalogues of warriors and places in epic poetry can seem slow to modern listeners, but they may contain fragments of ancient geography and political memory. Some place names belong to important Mycenaean centres that decline or change after the Bronze Age collapse. The poem remembers a map that is not exactly the map of later classical Greece. This does not prove every name is historically precise, but it suggests that epic tradition can carry old political landscapes long after their original systems have vanished. A palace may burn, but its name can remain in verse, attached to heroes whose real lives, if they had any, are beyond recovery. What oral memory preserves best is often not administrative reality but emotional structure, the fall of a city, the anger of a warrior, the grief of a father, the terror of a community behind walls. The longing for home after years of war, these are not fragile details. They can survive because each generation understands them. The exact cause of a Bronze Age conflict may fade. The names of minor rulers may disappear. The sequence of campaigns may collapse into one great siege. But the feeling of a world under pressure remains. In that sense, the Iliad may preserve not a newspaper account of Troy, but a cultural memory of catastrophe. The collapse of the Bronze Age makes this even more important. When palace systems fail, writing disappears from much of the Greek world for centuries. The old linear B script is forgotten. The bureaucratic memory of the Mycenaean kingdoms dies with the institutions that used it. In the silence that follows, oral poetry becomes one of the few ways the past can remain present. It does not preserve tax records, ration lists, or diplomatic treaties. It preserves a sense that once there had been greater kings, richer halls, stronger walls, and wars so terrible that later generations still measure themselves against them. No single explanation fully accounts for how these memories survived, but their survival suggests deep cultural need. People remember the fallen world because it explains who they think they are. Troy becomes central to that memory because it offers a perfect shape for loss. It is foreign but familiar, defeated but noble, doomed but unforgettable. The Greeks can imagine themselves as victors before its walls, yet the poem refuses to make victory simple. The Trojans are not monsters. Hector is among the most human figures in the tradition, bound to city, family, duty, and death. This complexity may be one reason the story lasts. A simple tale of triumph burns quickly. A story in which both sides suffer can carry grief across centuries. By the time the Iliad is written down, the real Bronze Age has already become distant. The singers inherit ruins, old names, half-remembered technologies, and a heroic atmosphere shaped by loss. They do not reconstruct Troy as archaeologists would. They rebuild it in sound. The walls rise again in verse, the ships return to the shore, and the dead are given names so they do not vanish entirely. Under the poem's beauty lies a quieter truth. Human beings fear that destruction will become meaningless unless it is remembered. Troy survives because memory refuses to let the burned city remain only ash. At the centre of the Trojan story stands a woman who may be the most famous cause of war in ancient literature. Yet the closer one looks, the more unstable that cause becomes. Helen is remembered as the face that draws ships across the Aegean, the woman whose departure from Sparta brings kings into alliance and turns Troy into a city under siege. But in the world behind the myth, human motives rarely fit so neatly into one beautiful figure. A woman can become the symbol of a conflict without being its full cause. A marriage can carry political meaning far beyond the private lives of the people inside it. A stolen queen, if such an event ever stood behind the tradition at all, would not be merely a romantic scandal. She would represent insult, broken alliance, damaged prestige, and perhaps the public humiliation of a ruling house. This is why Helen matters, even if history cannot confirm her as a real person. In elite Bronze Age society, marriage is diplomacy in human form. Noble women can link families, territories, obligations, and claims. Their movement between courts may seal agreements or expose rivalries. If a ruler's wife is taken, leaves, is abducted, persuaded, traded, or reclaimed, the political consequences could be severe. The poem and later traditions turn this into a drama of desire and blame. But the deeper structure is about honour and legitimacy. A king who cannot protect his household may appear weak. A rival who receives or seizes that household has challenged more than affection. He has challenged order. Still, the evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate whether Helen preserves any memory of an actual diplomatic crisis. She may be entirely mythic, shaped from older stories of divine women, dangerous beauty, and marriage contests. She may represent the way later Greeks tried to personify a war whose real causes had been forgotten. She may carry traces of ancient bride-stealing traditions, dynastic disputes, or ritual themes that have little to do with the actual destruction of a city. No single explanation fully accounts for her power. What is clear is that the story needs her because she gives human form to forces too large to see. Trade rivalry, palace ambition, and frontier politics are difficult to sing. One woman crossing the sea is unforgettable. Around Helen gathers the heroic world, and that world is built on honour as much as strategy. Achilles, Agamemnon, Hector, Paris, Priam, Odysseus. And the others are not modern individuals making private choices in a private world. They exist inside a culture where reputation is almost a second body. A warrior's name must outlive him, because death is certain, and memory is the only victory time cannot immediately take away. This value system may preserve something real about elite societies in the Bronze Age and early Iron Age. Though the poem's version is shaped by centuries of poetic tradition, status depends on gifts, public recognition, courage, ancestry, and the ability to command respect. An insult can become dangerous because it threatens the visible order by which powerful men understand themselves. Agamemnon's authority in the poem is not simple kingship over a unified nation. It is the uneasy leadership of a coalition, and that detail may hold a genuine historical insight. Aegean rulers, if they did campaign together, would have brought their own interests, rivalries, and pride. A coalition can be strong on the day it sails and fragile on the day supplies run short. Leaders compete for glory even while needing one another. The poem turns this tension into the quarrel between Agamemnon and Achilles, but beneath the poetry lies a practical truth: armies often weaken from within before enemies defeat them from without. The Trojan War tradition understands that a siege is not only a contest between city and invader, it is also a test of whether allies can endure each other. On the Trojan side, Hector becomes the great counterweight to Greek ambition. He is not simply an enemy champion, he is the defender of a city, a son, husband, father, and public figure carrying the burden of everyone behind the walls. Whether or not any historical Hector existed, the role he plays feels deeply rooted in the reality of fortified communities under threat. For the attackers, Troy may be a prize, obstacle, or symbol. For Hector, it is home. That difference gives the story much of its emotional force. War looks different from outside the walls than from within them. The men on the beach can dream of plunder, fame, or return. The people in the city must imagine what happens if the gates fail. Paris is remembered differently, and that difference matters. He is the beautiful prince whose desire brings disaster, a figure of charm, weakness, and fatal choice. In historical terms, he may preserve the memory of a younger prince, a diplomatic offender, or simply the narrative need for someone inside Troy to make the city vulnerable through personal action. Myths often place catastrophe in the hands of one person, because that is easier to grasp than the slow pressure of systems. A border city does not fall because of one man's desire alone, but a story gives that desire a name. Paris becomes the human spark placed in front of a much larger store of dry wood. The heroes also reveal how myth transforms political violence into moral theatre. A raid for wealth can become a campaign for justice. A struggle over access to trade can become revenge for a broken marriage. A city destroyed in the chaos of regional conflict can become the doomed stage where courage, pride, loyalty, and grief are tested before the eyes of gods. This transformation does not make the story false in a simple way. It shows how communities remember violence after its original causes fade. People rarely preserve old wars as lists of economic pressures. They preserve them as stories of betrayal, bravery, foolishness, and loss, because those are the forms in which pain remains intelligible. There is also a surprising tenderness in the tradition, considering how much blood surrounds it. The poem does not let glory erase grief. It pauses over farewells, funerals, ransom, aging parents, and the dread of enslavement after defeat. That last fear is historically important. For women and children in a captured city, the fall of walls could mean death for some and captivity for many others. Epic memory knows this, even when it surrounds the knowledge with heroic grandeur. The fate of Troy is not only the death of warriors, it is the breaking of households, the scattering of survivors, the conversion of free people into prizes. What survives in the record suggests that such consequences were not poetic exaggerations, but common realities of ancient warfare. So Helen and the heroes stand between history and meaning. They may not give us the literal causes of a late Bronze Age conflict, but they reveal how later people understood the stakes of one: honor, marriage, wealth, alliance, pride, and fear are not separate motives. They overlap until no clean boundary remains. Troy becomes the place where private desire and public catastrophe seem to merge, where a face can symbolize a fleet, and where the fall of a city can be remembered as both political disaster and human tragedy. Behind the myth there may have been treaties, trade routes, raids, and broken loyalties. Inside the myth, those forces are given bodies, names, wounds, and grief. That is why the story lasts. It does not merely ask why men go to war. It shows how easily they find reasons noble enough to hide the hunger beneath them. Beyond the poetry of Greece, another set of voices survives from the opposite direction, written not in song but in the formal language of kings, treaties, accusations, and imperial anxiety. These voices come from the Hittite world of Anatolia, from archives preserved far inland at places such as Hattusa, where clay tablets record the concerns of a great Bronze Age power. They do not tell the story of Achilles. They do not name Helen. They do not describe a wooden horse, a 10-year siege, or a doomed prince standing before high walls. Their language is colder and more practical. It speaks of vassals, rebels, boundaries, fugitives, oaths, and troublesome western lands. Yet inside this administrative and diplomatic record are names that have pulled scholars toward Troy with quiet force: Wilusa and Ahiawa. Wilusa matters because many scholars connect it with Ilios or Wilios, ancient names associated with Troy. The linguistic connection is not a casual resemblance invented for romance. It has been taken seriously by specialists, though details remain debated. If Wilusa is indeed Troy, or a kingdom centered on Troy, then the city steps out of Greek heroic memory and into the political documents of the Hittite Empire. This would not confirm the Iliad as history, but it would show that a place resembling Troy in name and location was known to a major Anatolian power during the late Bronze Age. That is a different kind of survival from epic. It is not a song remembering glory. It is an empire keeping track of a frontier. Ahiawa matters just as much. Many scholars identify Ahiawa with the Achaeans, a term later used for Greeks in epic tradition, and by extension with some form of Mycenaean power across the Aegean. The evidence remains incomplete, and the exact nature of Ahiawa is still discussed. Was it a single kingdom, a loose network of Mycenaean rulers, a powerful palace state, or a Hittite way of naming Western Aegean forces more generally? No single explanation fully accounts for all the references, but Hittite texts treat Ahiawa as important enough to matter diplomatically, and at times powerful enough to be addressed with caution. This is crucial. It suggests that the Western Sea was not an empty margin in Hittite eyes. It was a zone where outside powers could interfere. One of the most famous documents in this discussion is often called the Tawagalawa letter, a Hittite text involving disputes in western Anatolia and a figure associated with Ahiawa. The text is damaged and difficult, but it appears to refer to tensions involving territories and perhaps past conflict over Wilusa. The details are debated, yet the atmosphere is unmistakable. Western Anatolia is politically unstable, and the Hittite king is concerned about the role of Ahiawa in that stability. This is not the Iliad. It is something more fragmentary and more frustrating, but it places the broad ingredients of the Trojan tradition Anatolia, Western powers, contested cities, and high-level diplomacy inside the same historical horizon. Another important text is the Alexandru Treaty, an agreement between the Hittite king and a ruler of Wilusa named Alexandru. The name has drawn attention because it resembles Alexandros, another name for Paris in Greek tradition. This resemblance is intriguing, but it must be handled carefully. It does not prove that Paris was a historical prince of Troy, nor does it prove that the myth directly preserves this ruler. Names can travel, repeat, and mislead. Still, the treaty itself is valuable because it shows Wilusa as a political entity with a ruler bound into Hittite diplomatic structures. Troy, if Wilusa is Troy, was not merely a romantic city waiting for Greek ships. It was part of an Anatolian world of treaties, obligations, and imperial oversight. This changes the way the Trojan War can be imagined. Instead of a simple conflict between Greeks and Trojans floating in heroic isolation, the historical background becomes a frontier struggle involving multiple powers. Wilusa may have stood within the orbit of Hittite influence, though perhaps not always securely. Ahiawa may have represented Mycenaean interests pushing across the Aegean. Local rulers in western Anatolia may have shifted loyalties depending on pressure, opportunity, and fear. A conflict at Troy, if one occurred, might have been not only a raid or siege, but also part of a larger contest over influence in a border region. The poem remembers warriors before walls. The tablets remember political friction around the edges of empire. The Hittite documents also remind us how different history looks when written by bureaucracies instead of poets. In epic, a war can turn on rage, beauty, honor, and fate. In imperial records, conflict turns on broken agreements, unstable vassals, dangerous outsiders, and the practical need to keep distant territories from slipping away. These are not mutually exclusive. A diplomatic crisis can be remembered later as a personal betrayal. A frontier rebellion can become a heroic expedition. A struggle between powers can be condensed into the image of ships crossing the sea for one unforgettable cause. What survives in the record suggests that Troy's world had enough political tension to feed legend, even if legend transformed the tension beyond recognition. There is a lesser-known irony here. The Greek tradition made Troy immortal, but the Hittite texts may preserve the city closer to its own political reality. They show not a doomed literary symbol, but a place entangled in alliances and pressure. They suggest that the people of Troy, or Wilusa, may have lived under the gaze of stronger powers, negotiating survival between inland empire and seaborne influence. Their rulers may have sworn loyalty, requested help, feared enemies, and balanced obligations that ordinary farmers and craftspeople would experience only through taxes, labour, conscription, or sudden war. The grand myth of Troy often begins with desire. The documents hint at something colder, the vulnerability of a small kingdom caught between larger ambitions. Yet these tablets do not solve the mystery. They are damaged, partial, and written from the Hittite point of view. They do not describe the archaeology of Hisarlik in detail. They do not tell us whether a Greek coalition attacked the city, whether a siege occurred, or whether the destruction levels at Troy correspond to any specific event mentioned in Hittite records. Scholars still debate the geography of some place names and the interpretation of key passages. The temptation to force every tablet into the shape of the Iliad must be resisted. The Hittite clues are strongest when allowed to remain what they are, evidence of a real, late Bronze Age political world in which a Troy-like Wilusa and an Achaean-like Ahiawa could come into tension. That is enough to make the old story feel heavier. Troy is no longer only a mound interpreted through Greek memory. It becomes a node in an international system, noticed by empire, touched by diplomacy, and perhaps endangered by the ambitions of powers on both sides of the sea. The Hittite tablets do not give us Hector's last stand, but they give us the kind of world in which a Hector could matter, a world of vulnerable cities, oath-bound rulers, uncertain alliances, and conflicts remembered differently by every side. In the clay archives of Anatolia, Troy does not appear as a dream. It appears, dimly and imperfectly, as politics. And sometimes politics, after enough time has passed and enough people have died, is exactly what becomes myth. For centuries, Troy survives more clearly in books than in earth. Scholars read Homer, travellers cross the Troad, and arguments gather around maps, ancient place names, river courses, and the stubborn question of where the city had actually stood. Some believe the poems preserve a real place. Others see only heroic imagination. The mound at Hisarlik waits in plain sight, holding its layers under grass and soil while the debate circles around it. Then, in the 19th century, a man arrives whose ambition is powerful enough to change archaeology forever, and reckless enough to damage the very past he dreams of saving. Heinrich Schliemann does not approach Troy as a cautious modern excavator. He approaches it like a believer storming a gate. Schliemann is one of those figures history cannot comfortably admire or dismiss. He is energetic, wealthy, multilingual, self-invented, and consumed by Homer. He wants Troy not as an abstract scholarly possibility, but as a prize to be seized from the ground. In an age when archaeology is still forming its methods, this kind of obsession can appear heroic to some and disastrous to others. He is not the first person to suspect Hisarlik may be ancient Troy. Frank Calvert, a British consular official and landowner in the region, had already recognised the mound's promise and carried out exploratory work there. Calvert's role is essential, though for a long time it was overshadowed by Schliemann's fame. What survives in the record suggests that Troy's rediscovery was not the work of one lone genius, but of knowledge, opportunity, money, and ambition converging on the same hill. Schliemann, however, becomes the name attached to the drama because he digs with theatrical force. He wants to reach the Homeric city, and to reach it, he cuts deep into the mound. The great trench he drives through Hisarlik is now one of the most notorious wounds in the history of excavation. He removes later layers in the belief that the Troy of Priam must lie far below, in the older, grander-looking remains. To him, depth seems to mean authenticity. The deeper he goes, the closer he imagines himself moving toward Homer. But Troy is not a simple stack in which the most famous city waits conveniently at the bottom. The layer he identifies as Priam's Troy is far too early for the traditional late Bronze Age setting of the Trojan War. In his hunger for the city of the poem, he destroys or disturbs parts of the very levels that later archaeologists would consider more relevant. This is the dangerous dream at the heart of Schliemann's work. He proves that Hisarlik is an extraordinary ancient site, but he also shows how destructive certainty can be when it arrives before patience. Archaeology depends on context. An object matters not only because it is beautiful, but because of where it lies, what surrounds it, what layer holds it, and how it relates to other evidence. A gold ornament removed from its setting becomes less informative than it might have been. A wall cut through too quickly loses part of its story. Schliemann's methods belong partly to his time, but even by the standards of that era, his haste and self-promotion drew criticism. Scholars still debate aspects of his claims, his handling of finds, and the stories he told about his discoveries. No single explanation fully accounts for the mixture of brilliance, vanity, courage, and damage that marks his career. The most famous discovery associated with him is the so-called Treasure of Priam. The name alone reveals the problem. Schliemann finds a cache of precious objects, including gold jewellery, vessels, weapons, and ornaments, and presents them to the world as the treasure of the legendary Trojan king. The image is irresistible, the lost wealth of Homer's Troy lifted from the earth by the man who believed when others doubted. But the dating is wrong. The treasure comes from a much earlier period than any plausible historical Trojan War. Priam, if he had any historical counterpart at all, lived many centuries later than the level from which those objects came. The treasure is real, magnificent, and historically important, but the story attached to it is a romantic misidentification. There is also a human drama in the way the treasure is presented. Schliemann famously associates his wife Sophia with the jewels, creating one of the most iconic images of early archaeology, a modern woman adorned with what he claimed were the ornaments of an ancient queen. Whether every detail of his account is reliable remains uncertain, and the episode has often been treated as part discovery, part performance. It reveals how archaeology in the 19th century could become theatre for the public imagination. Ancient objects were not only studied, they were staged. Troy was not merely excavated, it was announced to the world as if legend itself had been captured. Yet it would be too simple to treat Schliemann only as a vandal, without his wealth, intensity, and refusal to accept that Troy was merely fictional. Hisarlik might not have entered public consciousness with such force. He helped make the ancient Aegean visible in a new way. His later work at Mycenae revealed graves and objects that transformed understanding of prehistoric Greece, even when his interpretations were imperfect. He forced scholars to confront the possibility that epic tradition might rest on a deeper archaeological past. The tragedy is that his gift and his damage come from the same source, absolute conviction. He sees what others hesitate to see, and he cuts through what he does not yet understand. At Hisarlik, the consequences remain physical. The Great Trench is still part of the site's story, a reminder that modern discovery can become another form of destruction layered atop ancient destruction. Troy was burned, shaken, rebuilt, and then wounded by the search for itself. This is a lesser-known but essential part of the city's modern fate. The mound did not simply surrender its secrets. It was forced open by people carrying Homer in one hand and shovels in the other. Some of what they found changed history. Some of what they destroyed can never be recovered. Schliemann's dream also changed the way the public thought about myth. Before him, Troy could be treated comfortably as literature, a place of heroic imagination rather than archaeology. After him, the question became harder to ignore. Here was a real mound, filled with real cities in the right broad region, with fortifications and destructions. The match was not simple, but it was too powerful to dismiss. The real Troy was not exactly the Troy he sought, and the evidence did not obey his desire. But the hill above the strait had answered loudly enough to make the world listen. In the end, Schliemann stands like a warning at the gate of Troy's modern rediscovery. He reminds us that the past can be lost through neglect, but also through love when love becomes impatient. He wanted to bring Homer's city back into the light, and in doing so, he both revealed and damaged the layered reality beneath the poem. The story of Troy after Schliemann is therefore not only about ancient war, it is about how modern people search for ancient truth, how easily they mistake longing for proof, and how every excavation adds another layer to the history it uncovers. After Schliemann, Troy could no longer be treated as a simple prize pulled from the soil. The mound had become famous, but fame did not make it understood. If anything, fame made the problem harder, because every wall, jar, ash layer, and stone foundation was now forced to answer a question too large for any single object. Was this Homer's Troy? Later archaeologists had to slow the search down. They had to take a place wounded by early excavation and ask what still survived, what had been removed, what had been misunderstood, and what kind of city Hisarlik had actually been before legend covered it with heroes. The real change in Troy's story begins when archaeology stops hunting for one dramatic confirmation and starts listening to the whole site. Wilhelm Dörpfeld, who worked with Schliemann and later continued at Troy, brought more architectural discipline to the mound. He paid closer attention to the sequence of walls and buildings, and he argued that the impressive remains of Troy 6, not the much earlier level Schliemann had favoured, were more likely to belong to the age behind the Trojan War tradition. This was an important correction. Troy 6 had powerful fortifications, carefully built stonework, and signs of a settlement more suitable to the grandeur later remembered in epic. Yet even this interpretation did not settle the matter. Troy 6 seemed to end with destruction, but perhaps by earthquake rather than siege. The city looked strong, but a strong city is not automatically Homer's city. Archaeology was becoming more careful, and careful archaeology rarely gives the simple answer people most want. Later, Carl Blegen and his team brought a still more systematic approach in the 20th century. They refined the sequence, distinguished phases more clearly, and shifted attention toward Troy 7a as a possible candidate for a conflict remembered in the Trojan tradition. Troy 7a appeared poorer and more crowded than Troy 6, but it also showed signs that seemed compatible with stress houses packed tightly together, storage jars sunk into floors, and destruction by fire. For those looking for a siege, this level had a haunting appeal, suggested a community under pressure, perhaps storing supplies, perhaps living with danger close at hand, but the evidence remained incomplete. Fire can follow many causes. Crowding can mean population pressure, emergency conditions, or changes in household organization. Storage jars can suggest preparation, but they cannot tell us who stood outside the walls. This is how archaeology changed Troy forever, not by replacing myth with certainty, but by replacing one myth of certainty with a more disciplined uncertainty. The city became more real and less convenient at the same time. Excavation revealed that Hisarlik had been occupied for thousands of years, that it had suffered multiple destructions, that its people were connected to both Anatolia and the Aegean, and that its late Bronze Age phases belonged to a world in which conflict was plausible. But archaeology also showed that the poem could not simply be read downward into the soil. There was no clean layer labelled with the names of heroes. No battlefield record emerged from the dust. No single discovery could carry the full weight of the Iliad. What survived in the records suggests a historical setting rich enough to inspire epic, but not a perfect mirror of epic. One of the most important later changes was the recognition that Troy may have been larger than the citadel alone. For a long time, critics argued that Hisarlik seemed too small to match the powerful city of tradition. A tiny fortress could hardly justify a great war, even allowing for poetic exaggeration. But more recent work around the mound found evidence suggesting a lower town beyond the main fortified height, including traces of defensive features and occupation outside the citadel. Scholars still debate the size, density, and population of this lower settlement, but the possibility matters. It shifts Troy from a small hilltop stronghold towards something more like a regional centre, with an elite citadel above and a broader community below. This does not prove Homer. It makes the real city harder to dismiss. The lower town also changes the human imagination of Troy. The city is no longer only kings behind walls. It becomes neighbourhoods, workshops, animals, storage areas, paths, wells, ovens, and households living in the shadow of the citadel. A larger Troy would have had more people to feed, more gates to guard, more social differences, and more vulnerability in times of war. During peace, its lower areas may have been full of movement traders arriving, farmers bringing produce, craftspeople shaping goods, children running between houses, animals pressing through narrow spaces. During danger, those same spaces become exposed. If attackers come, the lower town suffers first. The citadel is the last refuge, but the life of the city extends beyond its strongest stones. Archaeology also placed Troy inside environmental history. The coastline of the Bronze Age was not exactly the coastline of today. Rivers carried sediment, bays changed shape, marshlands formed and vanished. The relationship between the mound, the sea, and the plain shifted across centuries. This matters because the poem imagines ships near the battlefield and a city within reach of the shore, while modern visitors see the sea at a distance. Geological and archaeological work helps explain how the ancient landscape may have looked different. Though reconstructions remain debated, Troy was not fixed inside a timeless backdrop. Its setting changed, and that change reminds us that landscapes can bury history as effectively as soil buries walls. The later excavations also corrected the old habit of treating Troy as culturally simple. The city was not purely Greek, nor purely a remote Anatolian fortress untouched by the Aegean. Its material culture suggests contact, adaptation, and mixture. Imported Mycenaean pottery appears, but local traditions remain strong. Architectural and cultural patterns point toward a city living between worlds rather than belonging entirely to one. This may be one of the most historically important insights. The Troy of legend became a symbol of East against West for many later readers, but the real Troy seems to have occupied a borderland where such clean divisions dissolve. It was connected across the sea and inland at the same time. What archaeology changed most deeply, then, was the question itself. The old question asked whether Homer was true. The better question asks how a real Bronze Age city, repeatedly built and destroyed near a strategic crossing, became the centre of a story that later Greeks used to remember war. identity, loss, and heroic time. Troy is not less fascinating because the answer is uncertain. It is more fascinating because the uncertainty is layered, like the mound. The walls show power. The burn layers show catastrophe. The lower town suggests a wider human community. The imported objects reveal contact, the damaged context warn against overconfidence. Piece by piece, archaeology did not give back the Troy of fantasy. It gave something stranger and stronger, a city real enough to have lived, suffered, and vanished, yet incomplete enough for memory to keep building over it. While Troy is being built, damaged, and rebuilt on its hill near the strait, the world around it is beginning to strain. The late Bronze Age system that once seemed so wide and confident starts to show weaknesses that no single palace can control. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the great centres of power depend on movement ships carrying copper and tin, caravans carrying goods and messages, rulers exchanging gifts, scribes recording deliveries, farmers feeding storehouses, and soldiers enforcing obligations at the edges of kingdoms. It is a brilliant web, but brilliance does not make a web unbreakable. When enough threads are pulled at once, the whole pattern can tremble. Troy's story belongs not only to one possible war, but to an age when many cities discover that walls cannot protect a civilization from every kind of collapse. The late Bronze Age collapse is not one event, and that is what makes it difficult to explain. Around the end of the 13th and beginning of the 12th century, BCE, palace centres across the Aegean and eastern Mediterranean suffer destruction, abandonment, disruption, or deep transformation. Mycenaean palaces burn. Hittite power breaks apart. Cities in Syria and the Levant are attacked or abandoned. Egypt survives, but under pressure and with diminished reach, trade networks weaken. Writing systems disappear in some regions. Populations move. Old political orders fracture. Scholars still debate the balance of causes, because no single explanation fully accounts for the scale and unevenness of the crisis. It is not simply invasion. It is not simply drought. It is not simply earthquake, rebellion, economic failure, or piracy. It seems to be a convergence of stresses, each one making the others worse. Climate may have played a role, though the details remain debated. Evidence from parts of the eastern Mediterranean suggests episodes of drought and environmental stress that could have reduced harvests and strained food supplies. In palace economies, poor harvests are not just local misfortunes. They weaken the state's ability to feed workers, support armies, maintain loyalty, and exchange surplus for needed goods. A drought does not have to destroy every field to become politically dangerous. It only has to arrive in a world already dependent on coordination. If grain stores shrink while enemies move, trade falters, and rulers demand more labour, hardship can spread quickly from countryside to palace gate. Earthquakes may also have contributed. The Aegean and Anatolia are seismically active, and some destruction layers at Bronze Age sites show damage that may fit earthquake activity. But earthquakes alone cannot explain the wider collapse. Cities often rebuild after earthquakes, as Troy itself repeatedly demonstrates. Natural disaster becomes historically decisive when recovery systems fail. A cracked wall can be repaired if labour, authority, food, and security remain intact. If those supports are already weakening, the same cracked wall becomes a sign of something larger. Disaster is rarely only the moment when stone falls. It is also the question of whether anyone has the power to raise it again. Violence is unmistakably part of the story, but its source is difficult to name with certainty. Egyptian records speak of groups often called the Sea Peoples, a label that has become famous and sometimes misleading. These groups may have included displaced communities, raiders, migrants, warriors, and families moving under pressure from multiple directions. They were not necessarily one nation, one army, or one sudden mysterious invasion. The evidence remains incomplete, and popular versions often make them sound more unified and more supernatural than they were. What survives in the record suggests movement and violence on a wide scale, but also desperation. Some attackers may have been people whose own worlds were collapsing behind them. In the Aegean, the Mycenaean palaces fall into crisis. The administrative system recorded in Linear B disappears. Great halls burn. Centralized control over land, labor, craft production, and storage breaks down. This does not mean every person vanishes or every settlement becomes empty. Life continues, but in altered form. Smaller communities survive. Some places are abandoned, others shrink or reorganize. Skills persist unevenly. Memories remain. But the bureaucratic world that once counted bronze, wheels, oil, and grain is gone. Later Greeks inherit ruins without fully inheriting the institutions that made them. This is one reason the age before them becomes heroic in memory. It is close enough to leave traces, distant enough to become strange. For Troy, this surrounding collapse deepens the uncertainty around its own destruction. If a late Bronze Age Troy was attacked, burned, weakened by earthquake, or abandoned under pressure, it may have been part of the same wider unravelling rather than an isolated drama. A war at Troy, if one lies behind the poem, could have occurred in a period when many powers were already unstable. Mycenaean forces might have attacked while their own palace world was under strain. Anatolian alliances may have weakened as Hittite control faltered. Local rulers may have shifted sides more urgently as old protections failed. A city that once profited from connection could become vulnerable when connection turned chaotic. This is one of the most sobering layers of the Trojan story. The city's strategic position, once a source of advantage, could become a liability in a collapsing world. Routes that brought trade could bring refugees, raiders, and armies. Ships waiting for wind could carry not only goods but hunger and violence. A borderland community accustomed to negotiation might find that there is no stable authority left with whom to negotiate. The old tools of survival gifts, treaties, alliances. Walls begin to fail when the system around them loses coherence. Troy may have stood at a crossing just as the crossing itself became dangerous in new ways. The collapse also changes what victory would mean. If Mycenaean attackers destroyed Troy, their triumph did not lead to lasting dominance over the eastern Mediterranean. Their own palace centres soon suffered destruction or decline. If Troy fell, it fell into a world where many victors were also losing their future. This gives the legend an unintended historical irony. The Greeks of the poem win the war, but the Bronze Age world that could have sent them does not endure. The city burns, but so do the halls of those who may have threatened it. In this sense, Troy becomes not the story of one civilization defeating another, but of an entire order entering darkness. Yet collapse is never only disappearance. It is transformation. People continue to farm, sail, marry, mourn, trade, and remember. They reuse stones. They tell stories beside hearths. They bury the dead and teach children the names of places whose old meanings have changed. Out of the broken Bronze Age come new societies, new identities, and eventually new forms of Greek culture. The loss of writing in parts of the Aegean creates silence, but not emptiness. Oral tradition grows inside that silence, carrying memories of bronze-clad warriors, high-walled cities, and wars from a time before the present world. Troy survives because the collapse that destroys its age also creates the conditions for its myth. So the fall of Troy, whether as history, memory, or both, should be heard against the wider cracking of the Eastern Mediterranean. It is not only a city's disaster, it is one note in a larger sound: palaces burning, roots failing, kings losing reach, people moving under fear, and old certainties becoming ruins. The mound at Hisarlik holds its own layers of ash and rebuilding, but beyond it lies a whole region learning that even the strongest systems can become fragile when too many pressures arrive together. Troy's walls may have faced a human enemy, a shaken earth, a failing network, or all of these at once. The evidence does not let us choose too easily. It leaves us with something more haunting: a city caught in the twilight of an age, remembered because its ruin came to stand for the ruin of a world. After the Bronze Age world breaks apart, Troy does something that few ruined cities ever manage. It keeps changing after it is gone. The living city fades, rebuilds in altered forms, loses its old political place, and becomes part of landscapes ruled by other peoples and other powers, but its name does not sink quietly with its walls. Instead, Troy travels into language. It becomes a memory carried by Greek singers, then by written poetry, then by historians, rulers, travellers, emperors, medieval chroniclers, painters, and modern nations looking for ancient roots. The city buried in time becomes more than a place. It becomes a mirror in which later civilizations see conquest, loss, ancestry, warning, and grandeur. This is one of Troy's strangest afterlives. The less the real city is understood, the more powerfully the imagined city speaks. For the Greeks, Troy becomes the great testing ground of heroic identity. The story allows them to imagine a time when many Achaean leaders sailed together, when warriors from different regions joined one enormous enterprise, and when glory could be won against a noble enemy beyond the sea. Yet the memory is never purely triumphant. The Iliad does not end with the burning of Troy or with Greek victory. It ends in grief, with the death of Hector and the mourning that follows. That choice matters. The poem's emotional centre is not conquest, but mortality. The Greeks remember themselves as winners, but the poem keeps forcing them to look at the cost of winning. A city can be doomed, an enemy can be admired, and victory can still taste of ashes. This complexity gives Troy a deeper life than ordinary propaganda. If the Trojans were remembered only as villains, their city would be easier to destroy in memory. Instead, they become figures of dignity and suffering. Priam, the old king, becomes the image of age brought low by war. Hector becomes the defender who knows he cannot save everything he loves. Andromache becomes the voice of the household that war will shatter. Helen becomes beauty mixed with blame, longing, and exile. Even Paris, often treated as weak or reckless, remains part of a larger pattern in which private choices become public disaster. What survives in the tradition suggests that Troy endured because it was never allowed to be simple. Later, Greek writers return to Troy again and again, filling in what Homer leaves outside the frame. They tell of the wooden horse, the night attack, the killing of Priam, the enslavement of Trojan women, the wanderings of survivors, and the cursed homecomings of the Greek victors. These stories belong to a wide epic cycle, much of it lost or surviving only in fragments and later summaries. The evidence remains incomplete, and the exact development of these traditions is still debated. But the direction is clear. Troy becomes not one poem, but an entire universe of aftermath. The city's fall spreads outward into the fates of everyone connected to it. No one leaves Troy unchanged. Even the victors carry ruin home. The Roman world gives Troy another transformation, for Rome. Troy is not merely an enemy city destroyed by Greeks, it becomes an ancestral beginning. Through the story of Aeneas, the Trojan survivor who escapes the burning city and eventually becomes linked to the origins of Rome, defeat is turned into destiny. This is a remarkable act of cultural imagination. The fallen city becomes the seed of a future empire. The refugees of Troy become ancestors of conquerors. The ashes of one world become the foundation myth of another, in the hands of Roman poets, especially in the tradition surrounding Aeneas. Troy's loss is not erased, but redirected. The city must burn so that something greater, at least in Roman eyes, can eventually rise. This Roman claim is not history in the modern archaeological sense. It is mythic genealogy, political memory, and imperial storytelling. Yet it shows how useful Troy had become. A city once remembered as the target of Greek war could be claimed by Rome as a source of legitimacy older and nobler than its rivals. To descend from Troy was to inherit antiquity, suffering, courage, and divine purpose. It allowed Rome to stand both after Greece and before it, borrowing Greek heroic prestige while subtly answering Greek cultural superiority. Troy, destroyed in Greek song, returns in Roman imagination as the ancestor of power. Ruin becomes authority. In the medieval world, Troy travels even farther from Hisarlik. Kings, nobles, and chroniclers across Europe imagine Trojan ancestry for their own peoples. The Franks, the Britons, and others are sometimes linked through legendary genealogies to Trojan exiles. These claims are not supported as factual history, but they reveal the enormous prestige of the Trojan name. To say that a nation came from Troy was to say that it belonged to the oldest and most tragic nobility of the world. Medieval retellings reshape the story through their own values, dressing ancient heroes in the manners of knights, courts, chivalry, and Christian moral reflection. The Bronze Age disappears almost entirely, replaced by a Troy that looks like a medieval kingdom with ancient names. This may seem like distortion, and it is. But distortion is also how stories survive. Every age remakes Troy in the image of its own fears and ambitions. The Greeks see heroic glory and grief. The Romans see ancestry and destiny. Medieval writers see noble lineage, courtly love, betrayal, and the fall of great houses. Early modern scholars see classical authority. 19th century excavators see proof that poetry can lead to buried cities. Modern historians see a layered problem of archaeology, oral tradition, politics, and memory. Scholars still debate where history ends and invention begins, but Troy's power has never depended on solving that boundary completely. It depends on the tension itself. The city becomes a symbol of doomed greatness because it holds two truths at once. It is strong enough to be worth besieging, yet vulnerable enough to fall. It is foreign enough to be conquered, yet human enough to be mourned. It is destroyed, yet never fully lost. This is why artists and writers keep returning to it. Troy offers the image of civilization at the moment before disappearance, when walls still stand but fate has already entered the gate. Every age knows that feeling in its own way. Empires fear it, cities fear it, families fear it. A world can look solid until suddenly it is remembered only by those who survived it. The real Troy under the mound may have been smaller, rougher, and more complicated than the Troy of later imagination. Its people may not have known the names that poets gave them. They may have cared less about immortal glory than about grain, weather, alliances, children, and the safety of walls. But the afterlife of their city shows how human memory works upon ruins. It does not preserve the past unchanged. It selects, reshapes, magnifies, and grieves. Troy survives because it became the perfect vessel for thinking about loss, the loss of a city, the loss of an age, the loss of certainty, and the strange way defeat can become more memorable than victory. The hill at Hisarlik is quiet again. After all the poems, tablets, trenches, arguments, and centuries of longing, the place itself remains stubbornly physical soil underfoot. Stones exposed to weather, fragments of walls cut by excavation, and a plain stretching toward a waterway that still matters to the modern world. Visitors arrive carrying the name Troy, as if it already explains what they will see, but the site resists easy recognition. There is no perfect palace of Priam waiting upright in the sun, no clear mark where Hector stood, no visible line where Greek ships once rested, no final proof shaped like a spearhead in the dust. The city still beneath us is not one city and not one story. It is a layered argument between earth and imagination. Modern Troy is a place where certainty has to be handled gently. Archaeology has shown that Hisarlik was occupied across many centuries, that it held fortified settlements, that its late Bronze Age levels belonged to a world of Aegean and Anatolian contact, and that destruction touched the site more than once. It has also shown that the most famous version of Troy cannot be lifted whole from the ground. The evidence remains incomplete, partly because time damaged it, partly because ancient people rebuilt over it, and partly because early excavators cut through it with more desire than care. What survives in the record suggests a real city important enough to defend, connected enough to matter, and vulnerable enough to be destroyed or transformed. That is not the same as proving every element of the legend. It is something more uneasy and more durable. The uneasiness is the point. Troy sits at the meeting place of different kinds of evidence, none of them complete alone. The mound gives architecture, pottery, traces of fire, storage jars, defensive works, and a long sequence of occupation. The Hittite texts may give names that bring Wilusa and Ahiawa into the same broad world as Troy and the Achaeans, though scholars still debate details and interpretations. The Greek poems give emotional memory, heroic structure, and the long echo of a vanished age. Later traditions give afterlives, from Aeneas to Rome to medieval genealogies and modern nationalism. Each source adds something. Each source also distorts. No single explanation fully accounts for Troy, because Troy is not a single problem. It is a crossroads of history, myth, landscape, and memory. This is why the question of whether the Trojan War really happened can feel both necessary and too narrow. A war may well lie behind the tradition, perhaps a Mycenaean raid, a coalition attack, a struggle over Western Anatolia, a siege magnified by centuries of song, or several conflicts compressed into one great narrative. The strategic setting makes conflict plausible. The destruction levels make catastrophe real. The late Bronze Age political world makes tension likely. But the war as sung by Homer is not recoverable as a simple event. Achilles remains beyond archaeology. Helen remains beyond proof. The wooden horse belongs to the realm of later storytelling unless some future evidence changes the picture dramatically. The responsible answer is not that Troy is merely myth, nor that myth is straightforward history. The answer is that a real place gave memory something to hold, and memory made that place immortal. There is a lesser-known dignity in accepting that uncertainty. Modern culture often wants ancient mysteries either solved or dismissed, as if the only satisfying ending is a locked conclusion. Troy teaches a different habit of attention. It asks us to live with layers. A burned wall can be evidence of destruction without revealing the attacker. A treaty name can suggest connection without proving a poem. A heroic story can preserve old fears without recording exact facts. An excavated city can be real and still not match the city people hope to find. To stand at Hisarlik is to stand inside that tension. The ground says something happened here, again and again. The poems say that what happened mattered beyond one lifetime. Between those two statements lies the real story of Troy. The site also reminds us how easily landscapes outlast the meanings placed upon them. The ancient coastline shifts, rivers silt old channels, fortifications erode, empires rise, claim ancestry, and disappear. Scholars revise old theories. Museum cases gather objects once buried in darkness. Tourists walk where farmers, guards, potters, rulers, and children once moved without imagining that their home would become a symbol for the fragility of civilization. The Dardanelles still carries strategic importance, but the Bronze Age ships are gone. The hill remains, not unchanged, but patient. It has watched every interpretation pass over it like weather. And perhaps that is why Troy continues to matter. It is not only a story of Greeks and Trojans, or of myth corrected by archaeology. It is a story about how human beings turn destruction into memory, because otherwise destruction is too empty to bear. A city burns, and later generations ask who lived there, who attacked it, why it fell, and what its ruin means. They answer with poems, excavations, theories, paintings, national myths, and quiet walks through broken stone. Some answers are wrong. Some are partial. Some are beautiful enough to survive even when they cannot be proven. Troy gathers them all. So the city buried in time is still not finished. Every generation uncovers it differently. To Homeric singers, it is the stage of heroic grief. To Hittite scribes, perhaps a troubled western kingdom. To Schliemann, a dream to be torn from the earth. To modern archaeology, a complex settlement at a strategic crossing. To the wider imagination, it remains the image of walls shining for a moment before the fire. The final truth may never stand clear in the sun. But Troy does not need perfect clarity to endure. Its power lies in the fact that the hill is real, the ruins are real, the uncertainty is real, and the longing to understand them is real as well. The wind continues across Hisarlik. It moves through grass, broken stone, and the spaces where gates once controlled the passage of the living. It carries no voices now, yet the place feels crowded with them, builders raising walls, traders waiting for weather, families storing grain, rulers making promises, singers shaping grief, excavators cutting into the mound, scholars arguing over fragments, and travellers staring across the plain, trying to see the city that vanished and never fully disappeared. Troy remains there, beneath the feet and behind the eyes, not as a solved riddle, but as one of history's most enduring shadows. The story slows here, as all ruins eventually ask us to slow down. The dust settles back over the stones, and the sharp outlines of war soften into distance. Troy is no longer only a place of siege, fire, and broken gates. It becomes a reminder that every civilization lives between confidence and disappearance. People build walls because they believe in tomorrow. They store grain because they expect a season beyond the present one. They make treaties, raise children, repair roofs, carve names, tell stories, and trust that the world they know will continue long enough for those efforts to matter. Yet time has never promised that. Cities fall for reasons their inhabitants may understand only partly, or too late. A failed harvest, a cracked alliance, a ship that does not arrive, a gate damaged in the night, an enemy who was once a trading partner. A tremor beneath the stone's history often turns not through one grand cause, but through many small pressures gathering until the familiar world can no longer hold its shape. Troy's greatness, if greatness is the right word, lies in the way it lets us feel that fragility without reducing it to despair. For the people who lived there, Troy was not a metaphor. It was home. It was smoke from hearths, animals in courtyards, hands on rough walls, jars sealed against hunger, paths down to the plain, and the sight of distant water shining under a hard sky. The myth came later. The fame came later. The arguments came later. First there was a city where ordinary lives moved inside extraordinary geography, and where danger, trade, hope, and fear met at the edge of the sea. Now only traces remain, but traces are not nothing. A buried wall can hold more silence than a library. A broken jar can outlive the hand that filled it. A mound can keep the memory of many cities after every roof has fallen. And beyond the mound, the wind still moves toward the strait, crossing the same ancient threshold between worlds. It passes over the plain where history and imagination continue to meet, and for a moment the buried city seems less like a lost place than a quiet warning. What humans build may vanish, but what they fear, love, remember, and mourn can travel far beyond the ruin.